Hi students, welcome back. This is Professor Bridget and this is chapter 26, the urinary system, part 1. So before we move on to learn about the location of the different organs of the urinary system and their structure, I'd like to go over some of the general functions of the urinary system with you first. When we were learning about the digestive system, we learned about how food travels through, gets broken down, gets absorbed into the bloodstream, but we also learned that some products don't get absorbed into the bloodstream and therefore are eliminated as solid waste. The urinary system essentially gets rid of waste that is dissolved in your blood. So you might think to yourself, well, I wonder where that waste comes from. Well, it comes from all of the trillions of cells in your body that are carrying out their daily activities. They release waste products. Those waste products go into the blood, and then that blood gets pumped to the kidneys, which are an organ of the urinary system. That blood gets pumped to the kidneys, and then the kidneys filter out waste products. And one of the main waste products that we cannot allow to build up in the blood are nitrogenous waste products. Or another way to say that are nitrogen-containing products. So things like ammonia, right? The nitrogen waste products are accumulating in the blood as a result of normal cellular activity. And so those nitrogenous waste products need to be removed from the body. Another thing that the urinary system accomplishes is a balance of ions, or what we would call also electrolytes. So the urinary system is going to balance chloride ions in the blood, sodium ions, calcium, potassium, all of that all of those things are going to be balanced between the blood and your cells, and all of those things are continuously being balanced between the fluid that the kidneys are transporting and the urine and the blood. So there's this constant balance between or amongst these ions between what will become urine and the blood, helping to keep the blood in homeostasis. So for instance, if there's too much sodium building up in the blood, the urinary system will ensure that some of that excess sodium gets released as urine. The same would be true for potassium or calcium, and so on. Another thing that the urinary system accomplishes is stabilizing blood pH. So blood pH should be somewhere around 7.2. And the way in which blood pH, or one of the ways in which the pH of blood is held at a steady 7.2, is by regulating hydrogen ions in the blood. So adding hydrogen ions in the blood will decrease the pH. Removing hydrogen ions from the blood will increase the pH. And so there are special locations within the kidneys that are going to be monitoring the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood and adding or removing those hydrogen ions based on the pH. Another role that the urinary system plays is conservation of organic nutrients. So those are going to be things like glucose and amino acids. Both of those are really important to the body. Glucose, as you know, is our main source of energy, and amino acids are used for building proteins. They're the building blocks of proteins. So where possible, the urinary system would like to hang on to glucose and hang on to amino acids rather than allowing those nutrients to become part of the urine and excreted out of the body. So the urinary system helps to reabsorb glucose from the blood that hasn't been used or reabsorb amino acids from the blood that haven't been used rather than allowing them to be excreted as urine. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then lastly, the kidneys actually produce a hormone called erythropoietin. Sometimes that erythropoietin is just abbreviated as EPO, and it's secreted by the kidneys in response to low oxygen in the blood. And what it's doing here, let me change my pen color. What it's doing here is targeting young red blood cells or erythroblast stem cells in the blood marrow. And it's causing those immature red blood cells to mature very quickly and then leave the marrow and make their way into the blood. The more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen your blood can contain. And so that erythropoietin will be continued to be secreted by the kidneys until enough oxygen is in the blood. So what I'd like to do now is just introduce the organs of the urinary system to you. And one of the first things you'll notice and recognize are the kidneys. You've got a left kidney and a right kidney. And then the tubes, the yellow tubes that you see leading away from the kidneys, we've lost a little bit of formatting here, are called ureters. And so here's a ureter and here's a ureter. Those are muscular body tubes that are going to squeeze urine down to the next organ, which is the urinary bladder, or commonly just referred to as the bladder. So that's this structure right here. And that's going to be a temporary storage site for urine prior to elimination. And then lastly, that urinary bladder is going to excrete urine through another body tube called the urethra. And that's this tube that you see here. So that's really the body tube that's going to create a passageway for urine to leave the body. And there are some differences between males and females, and I will talk about those when we get there. So let me introduce the anatomy of the kidney first. And again, these terms, like always, are going to be very important for you to know so that you understand the language and the things I discuss with you later on in the lecture. But let me just go ahead and start with the outside. And it's this little pink line that you see all the way around. And that's going to be called the fibrous capsule, or you might call that the renal capsule. And so that's going to be dense connective tissue that surrounds the kidney as a whole. Now, superficial to that, and they're not showing it to you here, I guess I could probably draw it on, is there is going to be a nice layer of fat or adipose tissue that surrounds the kidney as a protective layer. There are no bones surrounding the kidneys. They're inferior to the very last of the ribs. And they are located right up against the posterior body wall. So they're susceptible to damage. Your authors have shown you a little bit of the adipose tissue here, but I wanted to make sure that you all recognized that superficial to that fibrous capsule is going to be some adipose tissue that acts as protection. Okay, so I'm going to erase that so this doesn't get too messy for you. And the next part of the kidney I'd like to draw your attention to is this area from here to here. And that's all the way around. Do you see how it's a little bit lighter pink there? All the way around. This is a region of the kidney called the cortex. And there are going to be some very important structures here in the cortex that are going to be carrying out some very specific functions. And we'll look at those in a little bit. The next part of the kidney is let me see, I'll use yellow, are what we call the renal pyramids, or you could call them medullary pyramids. I don't mind which term you use, each is correct. And that's all of these pyramidal shaped structures that you see here. And again, there are going to be some very specific structures within those renal pyramids that don't exist in the cortex. And then lastly, I'm going to do this with a highlighter. The area between the renal pyramids, those are called renal columns. And those renal columns are primarily made of connective tissue. And they serve as a route for blood vessels to pass through. So even in this picture right here, you can see blood vessels passing through those renal columns. So essentially, renal columns exist between renal pyramids. Then the next structure that you'll find at the base of each one of those medullary pyramids is a passageway, a section of tube. So you can see it right here. Still using the highlighter, so it's a little faded. But these little sections of tube right here, those are what we refer to as minor calyces. Calyces is plural, calyx is singular. So this is going to be the first spot where urine drips into. Essentially, and I'll just use one marker and then I'll erase it here in a second, urine is being produced by structures in the cortex and structures in the medulla. It's being produced there. And what happens is that urine eventually, or that filtrate eventually drips down into these calyces. And when that urine drips into those calyces, then it's going to begin its route out of the kidneys. So the next structure I want to bring your attention to structures are where these minor calyces merge. So for instance, at the top here, you've got 3 minor calyces, and they merge together to create a wider passageway. That's called a major calyx. So here's a major calyx. And those major calyces will merge together to become this main passageway here called the renal pelvis. And from there, urine will drip down into this muscular tube called the ureter. Blood supply to the kidneys is provided by the renal artery, which is here, and that brings blood to the kidney that needs to be cleansed. So that renal artery, for lack of a better phrase, is carrying dirty blood to the kidneys that are going to be filtered. That's going to be filtered by the kidneys. And then the renal vein, this blue vein right here, is going to be carrying clean or filtered blood back to general circulation. So you have to think about what's happening here in that. Let me erase a bunch of this first. You got to think about blood flow into the kidneys. After all, that's the main idea of having a urinary system, is filtering out waste products that have been carried in through the blood. And so I'll use light green here. Blood is going to come in, blood that needs to be filtered or cleansed is going to come in, and blood vessels are going to branch and get smaller, and branch and get smaller and go off in their own directions. And this is the direction of blood flow, right? And then ultimately, the structures that are going to be filtering that blood are located partially in the cortex, partially in the medulla, and then what drains out of those structures is urine. And so then you have this pathway that urine takes. So you've got blood coming in, being cleansed, and then you also need to have a route for that blood to leave, that cleansed blood to leave. And so that cleansed blood then leaves out that renal vein. I'm going to go over all this with you here in a sec. Let me again go ahead and erase all this stuff I drew on here. So that's blood flow into and out of the kidneys. And then lastly, there's a location on the kidney that we can refer to just kind of as a landmark, and that's called the hilus. And the hilus is this area right here where all the structures meet the soft tissue of the kidney. So it's really the entry point for the renal artery, the exit point for the renal vein, and the location where the ureter begins. So the way that I'm going to proceed for the remainder of this part of the urinary system lecture is we're just going to look at the vessels through which blood flows into the kidneys and flows out of the kidneys. Excuse me. So we'll start with blood flow into the kidney, and remember that blood is making its way to the kidney because it needs to be cleansed. We're not yet looking at the structures in the kidney that do the cleansing itself. For just right now, we're going to learn about the blood flow into and straight out of the kidney, and then I'll address the structures that do the filtration of the blood. So the aorta would be the main vessel that's carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart, and there's a branch off of the aorta called the renal artery. And so here in red, you can see the renal artery right here. And then, as you know, as blood vessels travel to their destination, they branch and get smaller and become more numerous. And that renal artery is going to branch. And the first branch that it creates, like there's one branch right here, there's another one right here. That first branch is called the segmental artery. And then as that segmental artery proceeds between the medullary pyramids here, it takes on a different name. There's another one here, right? And there's a couple of them here. There's one here. Those are what we call interlobar arteries. They're carrying blood between the renal pyramids through those renal columns. The interlobar arteries branch then and become what we call arcuate arteries. And think of it, these arteries as arcs that go over the surface of the pyramids. So there's one that I've already drawn. Here's another arcuate artery. Here's another. Here's another. Those arcuate arteries then are going to branch and give rise to smaller arteries in the cortex. And we'll just follow this example right here on top. So right here, that would be what we call a cortical radiate artery. So that's this one. Depending on the textbook you're using, your author might use the term interlobular. So that's not the same as interlobar. Interlobular is spelled a little bit different. There are a couple of extra letters there. So just so you know, those cortical radiate arteries may also be called interlobular arteries. All right, those cortical radiate arteries then are going to have small branches off of the side. And let me go to a different area on this picture here so that's easier to see. These little branches right here, you can barely see them. I'll show them to you on another picture too. Those are what we call afferent arterioles. And that's kind of the point where blood flow or blood will then be pushed through a filtration structure called the glomerulus. We're not going to talk about that quite yet. We're still learning about blood flow, so we're going to skip that, and we're going to trace blood flow out of the kidney now. So that blood is going to leave the kidney in exactly the same pathway that it came in from, but it's going to leave out of the veins. So right next to those afferent arterioles are little branches, oops, I don't have my pen on, little branches of blood vessels called efferent arterioles. And so blood begins its journey out of the kidneys via those efferent arterioles. And I'm going to skip peritubular capillaries for now. We're going to come back to that. Those efferent arterioles then drain blood into the cortical radiate veins, which would be located right down the center. All of those cortical radiate veins are going to dump their blood into arcuate veins. Those arcuate veins are going to merge together and drain their blood into interlobar veins. And then many interlobar veins are going to dump their blood into the renal vein, which is here. That's this big blue structure right here. Some textbooks will say that this section right here of that renal vein is actually what we call the segmental vein. But your textbook, the author explicitly states that there is no such thing as a segmental vein. We've got a segmental artery, but there's no complement. There's no segmental vein. So if you think about most of these terms, then both with arteries and veins, most of these vessels have the same name. One is the artery and one is the vein. So renal artery, renal vein, and then with the exception of the segmental artery, you've got the interlobar artery, interlobar vein, arcuate artery, arcuate vein, cortical radiate artery, cortical radiate vein. The only one that doesn't match up is that segmental artery. This last slide is a nice little graphic that shows you, without anything else on it except for text and arrows, the names of the blood vessels in order that are carrying blood into the kidney and the blood vessels that are carrying blood out of the kidney. I would memorize this if I were you, understand it, because there may be a short answer and or essay question about it in the future. You've got to understand the names of the blood vessels and the order in which they're carrying blood into the kidneys and out of the kidneys. Okay, so that's blood flow into and out of the kidneys. That's what makes up part 1 of our lecture. In part 2 of the urinary system lecture, we're going to focus on the remaining organs and the structures in the kidneys that actually filter the blood. So stay tuned for part 2.